It was a typical Tuesday morning, and I was sitting in our sunlit kitchen, savoring a rare moment of tranquility. The house was quiet, a welcome contrast to the usual hustle and bustle. I sipped my coffee and glanced out the window at the meticulously manicured garden, feeling a sense of pride at the life Jackson and I had built. Thomas entered the kitchen, his face lit up with an uncharacteristic excitement. Mom, I need to talk to you, he said, his voice barely containing his excitement. I put down my coffee, bracing myself for what I hoped was good news. Sure, honey. What's on your mind? I replied, smiling at my youngest son. He took a deep breath, his eyes sparkling. I'm getting married, Mom. The words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't process what he was saying. Married? I echoed, my voice betraying my shock. To whom? Thomas grinned, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Her name is Sarah. She's wonderful, Mom. She's kind, smart, and she makes me so happy. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. And what does Sarah do? What does her family do? Her family owns a small farm outside the city, he said, still beaming. They're hardworking people, Mom. You'll love them. A small farm. Hardworking people. My mind raced and I struggled to keep my composure. Thomas, aren't you sure about this? Marriage is a big step, and you come from a certain background. Thomas's smile faded, and he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and defiance. Mom, I don't care about that. I love Sarah for who she is, not for what she has. Isn't that what matters? I took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising panic. Of course, love matters, Thomas, but you have to consider the practicalities. Marriage is about more than just love. It's about compatibility and stability. Sarah and I are compatible, and we'll build our own stability, he insisted, his tone firm. I thought you'd be happy for me. I am happy for you, I lied, forcing another smile. I just want to make sure you're thinking this through. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. I knew you'd react this way, he said quietly. But I had to tell you, we're planning to have a family meeting to discuss the wedding. I want you and Dad to meet Sarah's parents. I nodded, my mind still reeling. Of course, we'll be there. Thanks, Mom, he said, his smile returning slightly. You'll see Sarah is amazing. You'll love her. As Thomas left the kitchen, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. I needed to talk to Jackson. This was not the future I had envisioned for Thomas. I had to find a way to steer him back on the right path. Later that evening, as Jackson and I sat in our study, I finally broached the subject. Jackson, we need to talk about Thomas, I said, my voice low and urgent. He looked up from his book, concern etched on his face. What about Thomas? He's getting married, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. To a girl from a peasant family. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about this? Thomas has always been sensible. I'm sure, I replied, my frustration bubbling to the surface. He seems determined. We need to do something. Jackson sighed, setting his book aside. We'll meet her family and see what we're dealing with. But Eleanor, remember, Thomas is his own man. We can't control his life. I know, I said, my voice breaking slightly, but we can try to guide him. We owe him that much. Jackson nodded, reaching for my hand. We'll figure it out. Together. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending disaster. My dreams of a secure, prosperous future for Thomas seemed to be slipping away, and I couldn't bear the thought of him throwing his life away. I resolved to do whatever it took to protect my son, even if it meant taking drastic measures. My journey to the life I now had was neither simple nor straightforward. Growing up in a rundown part of town, I had always harbored dreams of a better life. Our tiny house was crammed with too many siblings and not enough space, and the constant worry about money weighed heavily on all of us. I would watch the girls at school who wore pretty dresses and had shiny new things, and I vowed that one day I would have it all. Even as a child, I understood that education was my ticket out. I threw myself into my studies, earning scholarships and accolades. Yet, despite my academic achievements, the doors to the world I desired remained closed until I met Jackson Peterson. It was during my second year at university. I was working part-time at a cafe near campus, struggling to make ends meet. Jackson walked in one rainy afternoon, looking like he had stepped out of a magazine, tall, confident, and every bit the picture of the privileged life I yearned for. He was a regular customer, and we started talking. I quickly realized that beneath his polished exterior was a kind, genuine person. One evening, as I wiped down the counter, Jackson approached me. Eleanor, would you like to go out for dinner with me sometime? He asked, his smile warm and inviting. I looked up surprised. Dinner? With you? Yes, with me, he chuckled. I'd like to get to know you better. I hesitated, glancing at my worn out shoes and shabby uniform. Are you sure? I'm not exactly from your world. Jackson's expression softened. I don't care about that. I'm interested in you, Eleanor. That dinner was the beginning of a whirlwind romance. Jackson introduced me to a world I had only seen in movies and magazines. Fancy restaurants, elegant parties, and people who move with an air of effortless grace. I soaked it all in, determined to fit in and prove that I belonged. When Jackson proposed, I knew I was making the right choice. Marrying him was my ticket out of poverty, and I seized it with both hands. I poured all my energy into transforming myself, leaving behind the girl who grew up in a cramped house with peeling wallpaper. One evening, shortly after our engagement, Jackson took me to his parents' estate. As we walked through the grand halls adorned with family portraits and luxurious furnishings, I felt a pang of insecurity. Jackson, what if your family doesn't accept me? I asked, my voice tinged with worry. He stopped and turned to me, his eyes filled with sincerity. Eleanor, I love you. They'll see how happy you make me. And that's all that matters. True to his word, Jackson's family welcomed me with open arms. They were charmed by my determination and impressed by my academic achievements. I was finally living the life I had always dreamed of, and I vowed never to look back. Years later, our life was the epitome of success. Jackson was a respected businessman, and our social circle was filled with influential people. We had two sons, Dylan and Thomas, whom we raised with the best of everything. But while Dylan embraced the values I held dear, Thomas seemed oblivious to the importance of wealth and status. One afternoon, as I was reviewing the guest list for an upcoming charity gala, Dylan walked into the room. Mom, do you have a minute? He asked, his tone serious. Of course, darling, I replied, setting the list aside. What's on your mind? He sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. It's about Thomas. I'm worried about him. He doesn't seem to care about our family's reputation or the circles we move in. I sighed, nodding in agreement. I know, Dylan. It's been a concern of mine for a while now. He has such a kind heart, but he doesn't understand the importance of maintaining our status. Dylan leaned forward, his voice earnest. We need to help him see what's at stake. Our family's reputation is everything. We can't let him throw it all away. I couldn't agree more, I said, feeling a surge of determination. We'll find a way to guide him, to show him the path he needs to follow. As Dylan left the room, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I had worked too hard and come too far to let Thomas and naivety undo everything. My roots in poverty were a distant memory, but the lessons I had learned were ever present. I would do whatever it took to protect my family's future, just as I had done to secure my own. The contrast between my two sons was stark and undeniable. Dylan, my eldest, was every bit the product of his upbringing. A polished, ambitious young man who understood the value of wealth and status. He embraced the life Jackson and I had worked so hard to provide. Thomas, on the other hand, was different. He had a kind heart, but his disregard for the social standing we had achieved worried me deeply. Dylan had always been the golden child. From a young age, he exhibited a natural charm and an innate understanding of social dynamics. He excelled in school, not just academically but socially, always knowing how to navigate the complex web of relationships that made up our world. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Dylan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Mom, I've been thinking about expanding our social circle, he said. There's a new family in town, the Carters. They have connections that could be beneficial for Dad's business. I smiled, proud of his foresight. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Dylan. Why don't you invite them to our next dinner party? He nodded, pleased with the plan. I'll make the arrangements. They have a daughter, Caroline. She's about my age and seems very poised. You're always thinking ahead, I said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. You make me proud every day. Thomas, on the other hand, was a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. Despite our efforts to instill in him the same values that guided Dylan, he seemed impervious to the allure of wealth and status. He spent his time with people from all walks of life, valuing character over connections. One afternoon, I found Thomas in the garden, chatting with our gardener, Mr. Hill. They were laughing and discussing the best way to cultivate roses. I watched for a moment conflicted. Part of me admired his ability to connect with people so effortlessly, but another part worried about his future. Thomas, may I speak with you for a moment? I called, trying to keep my tone light. He looked up, surprised but smiling. Of course, Mom. What's up? As he'd approach, I could see the dirt on his hands and the smudge on his cheek, evidence of his hands-on approach to life. I wanted to talk to you about your plans for the future, I began, choosing my words carefully. He shrugged, his easygoing nature evident. I'm not too worried about it, Mom. I figure things will work out. I've been thinking about taking that job at the automotive plant. I frowned, unable to hide my concern. But Thomas, you have so much potential. You could do anything you set your mind to. Why settle for something so ordinary? He sighed, clearly frustrated. Mom, not everyone measures success by the same standards. I want to do something I enjoy, something that feels real. Real? I echoed, my voice rising. Do you think the life your father and I built isn't real? Do you think we don't work hard? That's not what I meant, he said quickly, his expression softening. I just want something different. I want to live a life that's true to who I am, not who everyone thinks I should be. Thomas, I said, trying to keep my emotions in check, you have to understand that the choices you make don't just affect you. They affect our entire family. We have a reputation to uphold. He looked at me with a mix of sadness and determination. Mom, I respect what you and Dad have done, but I have to find my own path. And Sarah, she's part of that path. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words. I just want you to be happy, Thomas. But I also want you to be practical. Love is important, but so is stability. I know, he said quietly, and I believe Sarah and I can have both. As he walked away, I felt a pang of uncertainty. Thomas was steadfast in his beliefs, and I couldn't help but worry that his idealism would lead him astray. That evening, I confided in Jackson as we sat in our study. I'm worried about Thomas, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He's so determined to follow his own path, and I'm afraid he'll make a mistake that could cost him dearly. Jackson looked up from his book, his eyes thoughtful. Eleanor, Thomas is a good kid. He's got a strong sense of right and wrong. Maybe we need to trust him a bit more. I know he's good, I replied, frustration creeping into my voice. But the world isn't always kind to good people. I just want him to be prepared. Jackson reached out, taking my hand in his. We'll support him, whatever happens. That's all we can do. I nodded, trying to take comfort in his words. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that our family was on the brink of a change I wasn't ready for. Dylan was everything I had hoped for in a son, a reflection of my own ambitions. But Thomas was a reminder that not everything could be controlled or planned, and that scared me more than I cared to admit. The days leading up to the family meeting were filled with anxiety and anticipation. I spent countless hours replaying my conversations with Thomas, hoping to find some reassurance in his words, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. Each time I saw him with that dreamy, far-off look, I knew he was thinking of Sarah, and it pained me to realize how little influence I had over his choices. One evening, I was sitting in my favorite armchair in the study, sipping tea and staring out the window at the darkening sky. The room, usually a sanctuary, felt unusually oppressive. I heard the door open and turned to see Jackson entering, his face etched with concern. Eleanor, you've been in here all evening. What's on your mind? He asked, settling into the chair opposite mine. I sighed, setting my teacup down on the table beside me. It's Thomas. I can't stop worrying about him, Jackson. This marriage, this girl, it's all happening so fast. Jackson leaned forward, his hands clasped together. I know you're worried, but we have to trust him. He's always been level-headed, even if his choices aren't what we expected. Trust him. I repeated, my voice tinged with frustration. He's throwing his future away for a girl he barely knows from a background that's completely different from ours. How can we just stand by and let that happen? Jackson reached out, placing a comforting hand on mine. We've raised him well. He has a good heart and a strong sense of himself. We can guide him, but we can't control his life. I pulled my hand away, standing up and pacing the room. But what if he's making a huge mistake? What if this girl isn't who he thinks she is? We've worked so hard to give him and Dylan a secure future. I can't just sit back and watch him risk it all. Jackson's expression softened, and he rose to stand beside me. Eleanor, you've always been the strong one, the one who saw us through every challenge. But sometimes we have to let go and have faith in our children. They're adults now. I turned to him, tears welling up in my eyes. I just want what's best for him, Jackson. I want him to have the life we dreamed of for him. And maybe he will, Jackson said gently. But it might look different from what we envisioned. We have to give him the space to find his own path. I nodded reluctantly, wiping away the tears. I know you're right. It's just so hard to let go. The night before the meeting, I found myself in the kitchen, unable to sleep. I was preparing a batch of cookies, a comforting activity that reminded me of simpler times. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, and for a moment, I felt the semblance of peace. Thomas walked in, drawn by the smell. Mom, are you baking at this hour? He asked, a smile playing on his lips. I smiled back, motioning for him to join me. I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd make something sweet for tomorrow. He leaned against the counter, watching me work. You're worried about the meeting, aren't you? I nodded, focusing on the dough in front of me. I just want everything to go smoothly. It's important to make a good impression. Sarah's parents are really nice, he said softly. They're kind, down-to-earth people. I think you'll like them. I paused, looking up at him. I hope so, Thomas. I really do. He reached out and took my hand, his touch reassuring. Mom, I know this isn't what you planned for me, but I love Sarah. She makes me happy. Can't that be enough? I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and hope there. I want you to be happy, Thomas. More than anything. But I also want you to be practical. Life is hard, and love isn't always enough to get you through. I know, he said, squeezing my hand. But I believe in us. We'll make it work. As he left the kitchen, I returned to my baking, the conversation replaying in my mind. I wanted to believe him, to trust that everything would turn out fine, but the fear of the unknown lingered, casting a shadow over my thoughts. The next morning, Jackson and I prepared for the meeting. I chose a modest dress, wanting to appear approachable but respectable. Jackson wore his usual suit, looking every bit the successful businessman. As we drove to the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. When we arrived, the cafe was already bustling with activity. We were greeted by the warm, earthy smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. Thomas and Sarah were sitting at a table near the back, their faces lighting up when they saw us. "Mon, Dad, this is Sarah," Thomas said, his voice filled with pride. Sarah stood up, extending her hand with a friendly smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Please call us Eleanor and Jackson," I said, shaking her hand and doing my best to smile. As we settled into our seats, the tension in the air was palpable. The waitress brought over menus and we made small talk while we waited for Sarah's parents to arrive. When they finally did, I felt a pang of anxiety. This was it, the moment that would determine our family's future. Sarah's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hill, were warm and welcoming, but their humble appearance contrasted sharply with what I had envisioned for Thomas. As we exchanged pleasantries, I couldn't help but feel out of place in this unassuming cafe, far removed from the elegant settings I was accustomed to. Jackson took the lead in the conversation, his charm and tact helping to bridge the gap between our worlds. "So, Mr. Hill, how long have you been farming?" "All my life," Mr. Hill replied, his voice steady and proud. "It's hard work." I nodded, swallowing my doubts. "That sounds wonderful. I wish you both the best." As the conversation continued, I felt a growing sense of unease. Despite their warmth and sincerity, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the life I had envisioned for Thomas. But as I watched him interact with Sarah and her family, I saw a side of him I hadn't seen before, happy, relaxed, and genuinely content. When the meeting finally ended and we said our goodbyes, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Jackson and I walked to the car in silence, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily in the air. As we drove home, Jackson reached over and took my hand. "We'll figure this out, Eleanor. We always do." I nodded, but the worry in my heart remained. I had spent my entire life striving for a better future, and now I faced the possibility that my son's happiness lay in a direction I had never anticipated. All I could do was hope that in the end, we would find a way to bridge the gap between our worlds and support Thomas in his journey, wherever it might lead. The tension that had built up over the last few weeks finally reached a breaking point. Jackson and I devised a plan to show Thomas the potential consequences of his choices. It was drastic and felt wrong, but we believed it was necessary to protect our family's future. On the day of the meeting, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Jackson and I had decided to dress in simple, worn-out clothes to create a stark contrast with the life we had built. The plan was to appear as if we had lost everything, hoping that Sarah and her family would reconsider the match. It was a cruel deception, but desperation drove us to it. Jackson and I dressed in old, ill-fitting clothes that we had found in the attic. I wore a faded, shapeless dress and scuffed shoes, while Jackson donned a threadbare suit. We looked at each other in the mirror, hardly recognizing ourselves. The sight was a painful reminder of the life I had fought so hard to escape. Eleanor, are you sure about this? Jackson asked, his voice heavy with doubt. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to be resolute. We have to do this, Jackson. It's the only way to make Thomas see reason. As we arrived at the cafe, my heart pounded in my chest. We were late on purpose, adding to the effect of our supposed fall from grace. When we walked in, I could see the shock and confusion on Thomas's face. He stood up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mom, Dad, what's going on? He asked, his voice trembling. Jackson put on a weary smile, playing his part. Sorry we're late, son. We had some trouble with the bus. Bus? Thomas echoed, looking even more confused. Why didn't you drive? I forced a smile, feeling the lump in my throat. We had to sell the cars, Thomas. Things have been difficult. Sarah and her parents exchanged worried glances, clearly taken aback by our appearance. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Hill, spoke up, her voice gentle. Is everything all right? You didn't mention any of this before. I looked down, feigning embarrassment. We didn't want to burden anyone with our troubles. But the truth is, we've fallen on hard times. Thomas looked devastated, his eyes searching mine for answers. Why didn't you tell me? We could have helped. Jackson sighed, his shoulders slumping. We didn't want to worry you, son. We thought we could handle it on our own. Sarah reached out and took Thomas's hand, her expression filled with concern. Thomas, we can get through this together. It doesn't matter to me if your family is wealthy or not. I glanced at Jackson, feeling the pang of guilt. This wasn't going as planned. Instead of driving them apart, our deception seemed to be bringing them closer together. Jackson must have sensed my hesitation because he took control of the situation. We'd appreciate your kindness, Sarah, Jackson said, his voice steady. We don't want to be a burden. Thomas, you need to think about your future. This isn't the life we wanted for you. Thomas' expression hardened, and he stood up, his voice filled with determination. I don't care about the money. I care about Sarah. We'll make it work, but let her what? I felt tears welling up in my eyes, realizing that our plan had backfired spectacularly. Thomas was more committed to Sarah than ever, and our deception had only strengthened his resolve. As we left the cafe, I could feel the weight of our actions pressing down on me. Jackson and I walked in silence, the reality of what we had done sinking in. When we got home, I collapsed onto the sofa, burying my face in my hands. Jackson, what have we done? I whispered, my voice breaking. Jackson sat down beside me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. We tried to protect him, Eleanor, but maybe we underestimated him. I looked up at him, my eyes filled with tears. We've lost his trust, Jackson. How can we ever make this right? He sighed, his expression filled with regret. We need to come clean. Tell him the truth and hope he can forgive us. The next morning, Thomas came to see us. His face was set in a determined expression, and he didn't waste any time with pleasantries. Mom, Dad, we need to talk, he said, his voice firm. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. Yes, Thomas, we do. As we sat down in the living room, I could feel the tension in the air. Thomas looked at us, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. Why did you lie to us? He asked, his voice trembling. Why did you think this was the way to handle things? Jackson took a deep breath, his voice steady. We were afraid, Thomas. Afraid that you were making a mistake and that you would regret it. We wanted to protect you. Thomas shook his head, his expression pained. Protect me? By lying to me? Do you have any idea how much this hurt? Sarah's parents were so worried, and Sarah, she was heartbroken. I reached out, my voice pleading. Thomas, we were wrong. We see that now. We just didn't know what else to do. Thomas stood up, his hands clenched into fists. You should have trusted me. You should have believed that I know what's best for my own life. Jackson nodded, his eyes filled with regret. You're right, son. We made a mistake and we're sorry. Can you forgive us? Thomas looked at us for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. I don't know if I can forgive you right now. But I love Sarah, and I'm going to marry her, whether you support us or not. As he walked out of the room, I felt a tear roll down my cheek. Our deception had driven a wedge between us and our son, and I could only hope that in time we could heal the rift we had created. Jackson pulled me into a hug, his voice filled with determination. We'll make this right, Eleanor. It's going to take time, but we'll find a way to fix this. I nodded, clinging to his words. Despite everything, we still had hope. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to mend our broken family. The days following the disastrous meeting were fraught with tension and regret. Thomas was distant, spending most of his time with Sarah and her family. Jackson and I felt the weight of our actions pressing heavily on us. We knew we had to find a way to repair the damage we had done, but the path forward seemed unclear. One evening, as I sat in the living room lost in thought, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Thomas standing there, his face serious. Behind him stood Sarah, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and determination. "Mom, we need to talk," Thomas said, his voice steady but firm. I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Jackson joined us in the living room, and we all sat down, the tension in the air palpable. "Thomas, Sarah," I began, my voice trembling. "We're so sorry for what we did. We never should have lied to you." Thomas nodded, but his expression remained stern. "We know, Mom, and we need to clear the air once and for all." Sarah took Thomas's hand, her voice soft but resolute. "We understand that you were trying to protect Thomas, but you need to understand that we love each other, and we're going to make this work no matter what." Jackson leaned forward, his voice earnest. "We realize that now. We just want what's best for you both. Please tell us how we can make this right." Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes meeting ours with a mix of hurt and hope. "We want you to meet Sarah's family again. This time, no lies, no deception. Just honest, open conversation." I felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of facing the hills again, but I knew Thomas was right. "Of course," I said, my voice steadying. "We'll do whatever it takes to make amends." The next day, we arranged to meet Sarah's family at their home. As we drove to the modest farmhouse, I couldn't help but feel a sense of apprehension. Jackson and I had dressed in our usual attire, hoping to present ourselves honestly this time. When we arrived, Sarah's parents greeted us warmly, their expressions cautious but welcoming. Mr. Hill led us into the living room, where we all sat down, the atmosphere tense but hopeful. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Hill began, her voice gentle. "We know this has been difficult for everyone." Jackson nodded, his expression sincere. "We'd appreciate your understanding. We're truly sorry for the way we handled things." Mr. Hill leaned forward, his eyes meeting Jackson's. "We all want what's best for our children. Let's put the past behind us and focus on moving forward." As the conversation continued, I felt a sense of relief. The Hills were kind and understanding, and they seemed genuinely interested in building a positive relationship with us. We discussed our concerns, hopes, and dreams for our children, finding common ground in our shared love for Thomas and Sarah. At one point, Mrs. Hill turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Eleanor, I know you want the best for Thomas. So do we. And we believe that he and Sarah can build a wonderful life together." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "I know, and I'm starting to see that now. They're both strong and determined. They'll make it work." Thomas and Sarah exchanged a relieved glance, their hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you, Mom, Dad," Thomas said, his voice filled with gratitude. "This means a lot to us." As the evening drew to a close, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in weeks. We're finally on the path to healing, and I was determined to support Thomas and Sarah in their journey. The next day, back at our home, I found Thomas in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee. I joined him, feeling the need to say more. "Thomas," I began, my voice soft, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've handled all of this with such grace and strength." He looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Mom. It hasn't been easy, but I know we'll get through it." I reached out, taking his hand. "And I promise, from now on, I'll trust you. I'll trust your judgment and your choices. You deserve that." Thomas squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "That means a lot, Mom." "Thank you." Later that evening, Jackson and I sat together in the living room, reflecting on the day's events. "We did the right thing, Eleanor," Jackson said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We're finally on the right path." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace. "Yes, we are. And I believe Thomas and Sarah will be just fine." As the days passed, our relationship with Thomas and Sarah continued to improve. We spent more time together, getting to know Sarah's family and finding common ground. The rift that had once threatened to tear us apart was slowly healing, replaced by a newfound sense of unity and understanding. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, tending to my flowers, Thomas joined me. He knelt down beside me, helping to trim the roses. "Mom," he said, his voice thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. You were just trying to protect me. I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes. Thank you, Thomas. That means more to me than you know. He smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. And I want you to know that Sarah and I are going to be okay. We'll build a life together, and we'll make you proud. I reached out, cupping his face in my hands. You already make me proud, Thomas. Every single day. As we sat there, surrounded by the beauty of the garden, I felt a sense of hope and renewal. We had faced our fears, confronted our mistakes, and found a way to move forward. And in doing so, we had discovered the true meaning of family, love, and trust. Our journey was far from over, but I knew that together we could overcome any obstacle. And as I looked at Thomas, I realized that he had not only found his own path, but had also shown us the way to a brighter, more hopeful future.